If I had a nickel for every time a woman disappeared after separating from her friends on a well-marked trail in the Great Smoky Mountains, I'd have 2 nickels, which is not a lot in today's economy. I'm Aiden Madison, welcome back to the Lore Lodge. It's pretty easy to get lost in the woods, in fact, considerably more so than most people think. Paths will sometimes become overgrown, weather conditions may obscure landmarks, and false trails often lead people astray. Even well-trodden marked routes like the Appalachian Trail can become confusing in some places, and in some places people leave simply because they think they can carve a better path by themselves. The vast majority of these individuals are eventually found, though not necessarily alive. But even when somebody is found deceased, the state of their remains and their physical location usually allows investigators to piece together what happened from the point that they left the trail to the point that they met their fate. Every once in a while, however, someone just vanishes into thin air, such as 7-year-old Dennis Martin or 16-year-old Trenny Gibson, both of whom disappeared in the Smokies without leaving a single clue as to where they'd gone. Having looked over a number of these disappearances in the Great Smokies over the last several months, what I did notice is that most of these people are young, between the ages of, 7 at the youngest with Dennis Martin, and then up into the mid-20s with Mark Hansen. So at first glance, it might seem like it's something to do with youth, but when it comes to Thelma Pauline Melton, that simply can't be the case. The 58-year-old woman, who stood at 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighed around 180 pounds, was last seen walking in the Deep Creek area of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, a place with which she was deeply familiar. Pauline's father, Fred McAllister, was a part owner of a campground just south of the Deep Creek entrance to the park, and for over 20 years, Pauline had spent her summers there. In late September of 1981, Pauline and her husband Bob were staying at that campground when the former left to go on a walk with her friends Trula Gudger and Pauline Cannon, and she would never return. And unlike many of our other cases, this one did not occur deep inside of the park, miles from paved roads and civilization. Nor did this happen along a more wild trail with plenty of confusing offshoots. No, Pauline went missing just 1 mile into the park along a gravel road which she'd walked without incident for over 2 decades. A trail which was right next to the very deep creek after which the campground and the area were named. Between her familiarity with the trail, the fact that that trail was, for all intents and purposes, a gravel road, and the fact that Deep Creek runs directly out of the park and back to the very doorstep of what was once their campground, you have to wonder, how the hell did she get lost? Despite how odd the circumstances of her disappearance were, Pauline's story is not nearly as well known as many of the missing 411 cases you'll find on YouTube. In fact, even David Paulides' entry in his Eastern United States book is really only about 2 pages long. According to Paulides, his information regarding this case was gleaned from National Park Service documents retrieved via a FOIA request, review of archived newspaper articles, and interviews with potential witnesses and participants in the search. Now, the majority of his narrative seems to come from one book that we've seen him cite before, Unsolved Disappearances in the Great Smoky Mountains by Juanita Baldwin, even though it is not listed as a source in this section. However, in the Abe Ramsey case that we covered, he mentioned this book by name, and his chapter on the incident reads a little bit more like a summary of the material in Baldwin's book than it does David's original work. That said, while I've been unable to find any National Park Service files online about this case myself, it is possible that David Paulides has access to something that is not yet on the internet. So it is possible that he got his information that way, and then of course there's the papers. Now, speaking of papers, one thing that has been a constant struggle for me when researching these cases in the past has been finding reliable information about what happened via the news media. Newspapers.com has been an absolute godsend because I'm almost always able to find a contemporary article on whatever I'm researching. But when I can't, I'm forced to sign up for subscription after subscription after subscription to random local news websites. And then I see them show up, in my bank statements every month, and I'm like, when did I subscribe to the news media in some small town in Australia? When did I do that? And because, it's something that I do really quickly and then never think about again, I don't notice it until I've spent hundreds of dollars on a website I don't read. And that's why I wanted to talk to you about our partner for today's video, Rocket Money. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that, along with helping you to cancel those unwanted subscriptions, also works with you to help lower your bills and to manage your money better. What makes Rocket Money so great is that it securely and safely identifies recurring charges and then uses that information to help you cancel unwanted subscriptions. In fact, you can even do it from the app itself with just a couple of taps. As someone who absolutely loathes dealing with customer service on the phone, that is just so nice. But in addition to helping you manage your subscriptions, Rocket Money will also allow you to upload pictures of your bills, and then just with a few taps, you can tell Rocket Money, hey, can you renegotiate this for me? The end result is that when users take advantage of all of Rocket Money's features, they're able to save up to $740 a year on their bills and expenses. In total, that adds up to more than $500 million saved across Rocket Money's 5 million users. If you're ready to start saving more and spending less, then you can go to rocketmoney.com/lorelodge or click the link right in the description to get started for free today. And if you like the free version and you're looking for a few more features, well, Rocket Money offers a paid premium version. Once again, if you'd like to give Rocket Money a try, you can go to rocketmoney.com/lorelodge or click the link in the description and get started for free today. On October 2nd, 1981, the Knoxville News-Sentinel published an article by staff writer Carson Brewer entitled Frightening Mystery of Missing Great Smokies Hiker Grows. It is a frightening puzzle, Brewer wrote. What happened to Thelma Pauline Melton, missing from a much-used easy trail in Great Smoky Mountains National Park for a week today? Pauline, who went by Polly, was part of a group of about 10 families which leased a plot of land beside Deep Creek, just outside the park, and placed their trailer homes there. According to Ranger Ron Cornelius, the reason they did this was that they wanted to stay in the area longer than the Park Service would allow at their campgrounds. To give you specifics, some of the families who stayed at this campground would stay there all the way from April through the end of October. So this wasn't just the kind of place where people were going for a couple of weeks during the summer, staying, and then heading back home. This was basically where many of these people lived half of their year. For Pauline and her husband Bob, their home in the winters was in Florida. If I'm not mistaken, Jacksonville, Florida. This group of families was reportedly pretty exclusive about who was allowed into the campground, not permitting any newcomers unless every family favored admitting the new family. And having bought in back in 1958, the Meltons were one of the longest-running members of this group. And as we mentioned earlier in the video, and according to the Charlotte Observer, Pauline's husband Bob wasn't her only connection to the campground. Her father, Fred McAllister, was an old friend of her husband and an owner himself. Sadly, Polly hadn't had great luck with her husbands, her first husband, Earl Bozeman, dying of an unmentioned reasons in the early 1950s, and then her second husband, Tom McKeithen, died of throat cancer sometime after that. It's hard to tell exactly. The Observer article seems to imply he also died in the 50s. Though 20 years Polly's senior, Bob Melton was a widower himself, and the two got married at the campground in 1975. Of course, along with Bob, Polly had several other friends in their little community, which was mostly made up of retirees. Going back to that article in the Knoxville News-Sentinel, Brewer wrote, near the middle of the afternoon last Friday, that being September 25th, 1981, Mrs. Melton and two friends, Mrs. Trula Gudger and Mrs. Pauline Cannon, walked from their summer home trailers up through the Deep Creek campground and on up a road along the creek to a turnaround. It's about 2 miles, 4 miles round trip. The three women had been friends for a very long time, Ranger Dan Burnett telling the Elizabethton Star that this was a routine they followed since 1958. On many days, the paper continued, some of them would hike 2 miles up Deep Creek Trail, an easy walking path that snakes beside Deep Creek and up to the aforementioned turnaround point. According to Ranger Chuck Harris, she liked the particular trail she hikes on because it was an easy trail with, and this is important, an excellent roadbed. I haven't been on this trail myself, but taking a look at it over on All Trails, it seems to be pretty straightforward and easy, with an elevation gain of only 253 feet, that's 77 meters, across the 2 miles to the turnaround point. According to Ranger Ron Cornelius, they reached that point without any issue. Then, after they'd walked about a half mile of the return, Mrs. Melton started walking faster and got several yards ahead of her friends. Depending on the source, the number of yards seems to vary a little bit. I've seen everything from she was just a few yards ahead to she was 75 yards ahead to she was half a mile ahead. I would wager that the 75 yards part seems to be the most accurate based on everything I saw. Part of the reason I err on the 75 yards aspect is because of the reporting by Carson Brewer, who wrote that the ranger said the others considered this a little unusual and that they called to her, making some comment about her walking so fast, and she looked back and laughed. Typically, calling out is something that you say in the context of, having to speak to somebody who's a ways off from you. You wouldn't call out to somebody who's only 10 yards in front of you. You would just talk to them. Similarly, you probably wouldn't call out to somebody who's like half a mile ahead of you because they probably won't hear you. So to me, that does imply that she was probably, somewhere between like 50 and 100 yards away. Obviously, that's something of an assumption, but I would argue it's a reasonable one. In any case, sometime following this interaction where Polly was ahead of them and they called out to her, she turned around, looked at them, and laughed. About a mile from the trailhead, Polly rounded a bend over a slight hill and disappeared from view. Based on the descriptions given in the papers, which were generally that she went up a slight incline and then around a bend and they lost sight of her going over that hill, I believe it was likely about right here that they lost sight of her. Trula and the other Pauline clearly thought that this behavior was a little bit odd, but they figured that she had just gone ahead and they'd see her back at the campsite. So they continued onward, got home, and upon reaching the campground, realized, oh, Polly's not here. Not only was she not there, but nobody had seen her return. When they learned she had not come back, the News Sentinel reads, the two women and Mrs. Cannon's husband, Jack, walked back over the entire route of the hike to look for her. When their search turned up nothing, they alerted the park rangers, who managed to get a search team out there around 5 p.m. Before dark, rangers were able to search for miles up the Deep Creek Trail and side trails she might have taken, including the Nolan Divide Trail, Indian Creek Trail, and the Hammer Branch Trail to Juniewank Falls. The Indian Creek and Hammer Branch trails both branch off just beyond where I believe she was last seen, while the Nolan Divide Trail actually leaves directly from the campground. In addition to the rangers involved in the initial search, dogs were also brought in for the first 3 days. But in order to limit scent contamination in the area, the number of people actually involved in the search was itself also limited. Despite their best efforts to preserve the scent, however, the Asheville Times reported on Tuesday the 29th that the dogs were unable to pick up a trail, and that Ranger Burnett said Monday would likely be the last day that searchers would use the tracking dogs. Instead, they reported on Tuesday that the search would be expanded, with foot units covering a larger area in the search, and that organizations participating were the North Carolina Search and Rescue Dog Association team from Canton, the Civil Air Patrol, and several Air Force personnel. I would give you more details about how the search was conducted and where they went and what they found, but there aren't any. So far as I can tell, 12 to 15 rangers, a few dogs, and a helicopter were about all that they used during this search. And by Friday, October 2nd, investigators were beginning to believe that it was more likely Polly was not any longer in the park. This was because during those few days that they were searching, they found absolutely no evidence that she had ever left the trail. No sign of a struggle, no sign that anybody was dragged, no footprints leading away, just she wasn't there. Granted, the search area was rather limited, but that was largely due to the fact that all of the people who knew Polly had told investigators she did not like rugged hikes. And if you've ever been down into the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, everything is rugged. Even a lot of the trails themselves are pretty rugged, but you go off trail and it's just dense underbrush as far as the eye can see, which is not far. One possibility, the News Sentinel reported, is that she could have left the park in an automobile, which were permitted in the campground but not beyond the gate at the upper end of it. While Deep Creek Trail is described as being essentially a gravel road, it seems that vehicles were not allowed beyond the campground unless it was National Park Service official business. If it were the case that Polly had left the park, or at least the campground, in an automobile, then one thing had to be true. Either she intended to disappear, or she was kidnapped right there in the parking lot. The latter would be pretty brazen, given that there was a good possibility that somebody in the campground or just outside of it would have heard Polly scream if she was attacked, but of course it is also possible that somebody could have pulled a gun, said keep quiet, things along those lines. In any case, her friend seemed certain that she would not have gotten into an automobile with anyone she did not know unless she was forced to. That obviously would imply foul play, and the pot of spaghetti sauce she'd left simmering back at the campground, as well as the widely reported fact that she wasn't carrying any cigarettes on her person, despite being a 2-pack-a-day smoker, supported the conclusion that she intended to return home that evening. But who would have taken her, and why? If by some miracle she was still there in the park, however, rangers were not optimistic. Brewer reported that some park officials think that if she is still in the park, chances of finding her are becoming pretty slim. That said, they did hold out some hope because the weather has not yet been so cold that she would have died of exposure, and she probably could have found water. She almost certainly could have found water. There are creeks everywhere. What was more concerning was Polly's physical condition, because in addition to being a 2-pack-a-day smoker, Ranger Ron Cornelius said that she was also suffering from hypertension. Hypertension is when your blood pressure is consistently higher than normal, and it causes an elevated risk for things like heart disease, stroke, aneurysm, kidney disease, and even vascular dementia. For reasons not noted in the paper, she also recently had a prescription for a tranquilizer filled just prior to her disappearance, which Polly's sister Kit Postel suggested could have had something to do with it. From what I can tell, the tranquilizer was the benzodiazepine Valium. Today, you probably wouldn't hear Valium referred to as a tranquilizer, but back in the 1980s, the terminology was a little different. Valium is in the same family of drugs as Xanax and Ativan, but it's a little bit faster acting and it doesn't last quite as long. It's the kind of thing you might be prescribed for acute panic attacks or just before you go into something like a minor surgery. I was given Valium before I had my wisdom teeth out, for example. When you take Valium, it usually relaxes your system to the point where you feel a little bit dazed. It's not like it doesn't make you loopy necessarily, but you're going to be a little slow to react to things. And that was the concern here. The paper specifically says that Kit Postel's reason to be concerned was that Pauline Melton might have become dazed and somehow wandered away. She also expressed frustration in the November 5th article of the Charlotte Observer at how the search was handled and communicated, especially since it was given up after only 4 or 5 days. After having patiently waited for 40 days, we've had absolutely no word, Kit reportedly said. It's easy to say she's not in the park, but how do they know? They haven't let the family know Doodlum Squat. Doodlum Squat's a new one for me. I heard Diddley Squat growing up. Trula Gudger had similar concerns, the paper reporting that she said, "I think she's still in those woods. I don't think she walked out of there." She suggested that Polly may have had a mental collapse, or that she could have had an aneurysm and walked off the trail in confusion. But despite these concerns, the Park Service remained steadfast that Polly had left the park. In that same November 5th article entitled "Missing Woman's Family Wants Probe," Observer reporter Dot Jackson reported that park officials maintain Melton left the park and say there is no evidence of foul play. I'm only going to bring this up right now because it's been relevant to recent discussions about recent cases that we've had, but it's not super important in this case. There is a serious difference between there is no evidence of foul play and we have ruled foul play out. A certain group of people under public scrutiny at the time of recording this video keep saying that the police say there is no evidence of foul play and therefore they have been cleared. That's not what that means, Proudfoots. Part of the reason that this little aside is also relevant to this discussion is that the paper also noted regarding the disappearance of Pauline Melton that the FBI could not become involved in the case unless there was suspicion of foul play. As those following the case I was referring to here, I'm just going to come out and just openly say I'm talking about Sebastian Rogers. For those who have been following that case, you may be aware that the FBI recently offered a $50,000 reward for anybody who came forward with information leading to the discovery, the recovery of Sebastian Rogers. Many people on the wonderful cesspool known as Reddit keep saying that the FBI getting involved here does not imply foul play. The FBI getting involved implies exactly one thing here, and it is foul play. Or, I should say, in my opinion, the FBI offering a reward for the finding of Sebastian Rogers implies that the FBI is suspicious that foul play may have been related to said disappearance. In my opinion. Allegedly. Perhaps. Perchance. So in this case, the National Park Service basically came out and said, we're not investigating this as foul play at all. We're not suspicious that there is foul play at all. Therefore, the FBI isn't going to get involved. In addition to that, the sheriff of the county did not have any jurisdiction over the national park, so he couldn't get involved without their request either. But interestingly enough, the government of North Carolina pretty heavily implied to the Melton family and their friends that they should request the assistance of the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. So that would suggest that the North Carolina officials involved looked at this case and went, I think there might be foul play, but I can't get involved without a request either. Since the National Park Service was refusing to make that request, the Melton, Postel, McAllister family as a whole could go to the Attorney General and request their involvement. Doing that would have allowed the State Bureau of Investigation to get involved. And then one final, possibly relevant detail comes out of the news reporting on November 5th, which was the information that Polly may have been wearing a considerable amount of diamond jewelry. The Observer reported that a Bryson City man who did not know the Postels had told them that the woman who disappeared was known to wear a lot of jewelry, and local people suspected it might have attracted the attention of someone who could have forced her off the trail. Polly's sister Kim confirmed that this was possible, saying she probably did have on a couple of rings and a diamond watch band. I will say that the specificity here raises my eyebrows a little bit regarding, how this information came to be. That's very specific. It's totally possible that she wore the exact same jewelry every day, but Kit was not there, so that's why I'm questioning it a bit. I don't think it's something to blow up over. I don't think it's something to immediately turn my eyes and go, oh, well, this was clearly Kit's attempt to get rid of Polly so that she could have the entire inheritance when their 89-year-old father, who was in poor health, passed away. I'm not saying that, and this is not an ironic thing of me being like, I'm not saying, this is me being serious. I don't think this alone is enough evidence to get there. What I do think it might be evidence of is that maybe they were trying to give a reason to call for foul play, because that piece of information did not appear until long after the formal search had ended. In addition to that, I have not found any corroborations from Trula, the other Pauline, or anyone else at the campground that Polly was wearing that jewelry that day. Still, with all of that information out in the open, with all the reported information indicating that she intended to return to the campground, the only reason I'd hesitate to suspect foul play in this is the broad daylight of it all. For Juanita Baldwin, however, there's a different reason. Lot's wife was on Sodom and Gomorrah Road. She looked back and became a pillar of salt. Her fate is explained in the Bible. On September 25th, 1981, Polly Melton was hiking Deep Creek Trail in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. She looked back and vanished. Her fate is yet to be explained. That is the opening passage of the unsolved disappearances narrative of the Pauline Melton story, and oh boy is that one of the paragraphs of all time. Strange opening passage aside, Baldwin's version of events largely follows in line with the narrative that we constructed from the news reporting, though several additional details present in her retelling drive her to a somewhat different conclusion. Instead of a kidnapping, Baldwin seems partial to the idea of an intentional disappearance based upon several factors. Under the subheading of Analyzing Polly's Life, Baldwin writes that on Monday, September 28, 1981, following Polly's disappearance on Friday, Tom Harris, pastor of Victory Baptist Church, told park rangers Mrs. Melton had spoken with him and seemed slightly depressed of late. However, he allegedly emphasized that she was not as depressed as she had been 2 years ago when she was a heavy user of Valium. In his opinion, she was not suicidal, but was not as active or tidy as she had been in the spring. Baldwin added that Pastor Harris had found out that a bottle of Valium prescribed for Bob Melton was missing from their trailer. Bob missed it after Polly disappeared. I'll get to why I emphasized that in a moment. In addition to the comments on drugs and depression, Pastor Harris apparently also revealed that he thought one conversation with Mrs. Melton might be significant, and that conversation had occurred about 3 years before she disappeared. It was just after Polly's mother had passed away, and Harris had tried to comfort her with the thought she would see her mother in heaven one day, at which point Mrs. Melton had said she wanted to go to heaven. Following this, she talked about persons who were running around on their spouses. She said she would never do that. According to Baldwin, in thinking back over their conversation, Pastor Harris said he had come to feel that Mrs. Melton had committed adultery and felt guilty. Along with that information from Harris, Baldwin also notes that on October 6, 1981, Nell Rickman, the supervisor at the Bryson City Presbyterian Church Nutrition Center, provided the authorities with new information. It should be noted that that is a different church from Tom Harris. Tom Harris was Victory Baptist. This is Bryson City Presbyterian. Supposedly, Nell had been out of town when the incident occurred, and she was therefore unable to get her relevant information to authorities until after the search had been suspended. This information does not appear in the papers, but Baldwin earlier in the chapter noted that Polly volunteered at that distribution center, that nutrition center, it appears to have been something of a food bank, every Friday. She went on to say that the procedure at the center was for volunteers to sign up at the end of the day for the next day they intended to work, and that while she'd worked on the 24th, Polly did not sign up to work on the 25th. Apparently, she offered no explanation to anybody for why she hadn't signed up, though it's unclear if anybody actually asked. But another unusual thing that Polly did on this particular weekend was that she allegedly made several phone calls using the church telephone, and investigators were unable to determine where these calls went, and nobody who knew Polly remembered receiving any calls from her on that day. Baldwin says that she interviewed several of the patrons at the nutritional center during her research and related that they found Polly to be friendly and helpful, and also told Baldwin about a time that she had joked about giving up on weight loss. Allegedly, the 5'10" or 11-inch tall, 170 or 180 pound Polly told them, "If fate would grant me a wish, I would wish to be light enough to walk without leaving footprints." Once again, I will draw your attention to the specificity of that comment. Earlier in the chapter, Baldwin had remarked that in her youth, Polly could probably have been described as an Amazonian beauty, and although she never confided that there had been lovers in her life, those who knew her had little doubt. At this point, however, she was overweight, suffering from high blood pressure and nausea, and taking medication for them, and Baldwin continues, writing that some of those who knew her had wondered privately if Polly was on the brink of a domestic apocalypse. Towards the end of the chapter, the author brings this notion of domestic unhappiness back around, noting that there have been rumors that she simply walked away from her life and began a new life with a new partner. Baldwin, writing in the third person, and in the sense that she said Juanita Baldwin interviewed people, not the author interviewed people. I don't know, maybe that bugs me for no reason, but it does bug me. She continued on to say that the rangers she interviewed were convinced that Polly was too intelligent and too strong to have gone with a kidnapper without a struggle. Now, in my opinion, that doesn't really track with what the rangers told the papers about Polly, which was that she was very unhealthy in multiple ways. And also, just because she would have put up a fight does not necessarily mean that she would have won that fight. On the other hand, the rangers allegedly remembered her as a big woman and a pleasant camper who knew the area too well to have become lost, even under medication. And they believed that had she found herself to be lost, she would have just sat down and awaited rescue. Baldwin also claims they told her that there was no bear or other animal in the area large enough to have eaten or dragged away a woman her size, so far that no trace of her could be found by the time the search was made. While I don't doubt that the rangers would have dismissed animal predation, I am skeptical of Baldwin's explanation for why, given that black bears are absolutely big enough to do that. You would also have to consider that had Polly seen a black bear and become frightened of it, she probably would have run away, which means that she would have ended up off trail somewhere. The issue there is that given how out of shape she was and the fact that she was not accustomed to hiking rugged terrain, she probably would not have made it all that far, and over the course of the several days that followed, the dogs probably would have smelled her decomposing. Unless, of course, she was in fact attacked by a bear, killed, and then buried underground, which some dogs wouldn't necessarily catch. That said, the dogs found absolutely no scent trail whatsoever, so this is kind of up in the air. Dogs are not infallible. You would think that they would have found something. They didn't. It could go either way here. Point is, I question what Baldwin said here. It's not that I question how the rangers did their search. I question what Baldwin said, and I'll get into my reasons later. Because I have more reasons than just that one thing. Anyway, at the end of the chapter, the author wraps everything up by suggesting that perhaps fate granted Polly's wish to walk away without leaving footprints. And if Baldwin's information is accurate, it does seem like a fair question. But can we trust Baldwin? When you Google the Pauline Melton disappearance, you will probably see sites like the Charlie Project and the Doe Network, both amateur but generally well-regarded databases, uncritically accepting Baldwin's narrative as an accurate representation of events. Typically, I would structure this kind of critique a little bit differently, but for the fact that nearly every article directly cites Baldwin's work on this case, and for that reason, I feel the need to address some credibility issues. I initially encountered this book while researching for a different case in this cluster, and to be honest, it was the content of that chapter that raised my eyebrows. First, though, I want to address some issues within the Polly Melton chapter. For example, Baldwin claims that contacts with Polly's two former husbands yielded no leads, which is certainly true because her two former husbands had been dead for years according to the papers. It's kind of hard to excuse that kind of an oversight as just a simple mistake, and it's also not the only one. Baldwin also says that Polly had her cigarettes on her when she disappeared, while the papers emphatically say the opposite. And then another issue is that it was Polly that had the Valium prescription, not Bob. So while it's not impossible that Bob might have noticed that a Valium bottle was missing, it also isn't ever said that Bob had his own Valium prescription or that Pauline had a Valium bottle missing. Like, there's absolutely no report I could find that said that there was a missing Valium bottle. You would think that if the investigators found a missing Valium bottle, that would have been mentioned somewhere, considering that her being on Valium was in fact mentioned. Specifically, you would assume that in Dot Jackson's article on November 5th for the Charlotte Observer, this would be mentioned, since that is the article that mentions the tranquilizer. Considering the fact that Baldwin does not cite a single written source throughout the entirety of this chapter, really throughout the entirety of the book, one should be extremely cautious in taking her words at face value, especially when she claims people said something in interviews and then doesn't provide any corroboration. But, like I said, my concerns over Baldwin's credibility extend beyond this chapter, and first arose when I was researching the Abe Ramsey case. I do feel like I should really quickly explain, because we get comments about this sometimes, that people are going, why are you attacking these people? Why are you tearing down the work of others? Why can't you just be supportive? I come from an academic background. Peer review is just what we do. I know that sounds a little dismissive, a little smug, maybe a little arrogant, but I'm just getting tired of explaining it to people. When I criticize David Paulides' work, I'm not impugning his character. I'm saying I don't think his work is credible. Somebody can both be a good person and a bad researcher. There's a reason that when I attack someone's work, I attack their work, not their person, not who they are. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm not coming in here to say that Juanita Baldwin is a bad person who's making up stories. I'm not saying that about David Paulides either. I'm just saying that reading their work, I'm not particularly inclined to trust it. In fact, if you go back and look at our comment sections on videos that are really over a year and a half old, you'll see a lot of people going, hey, this person did this case also, and they found some things that you got wrong here. One of the most common that we saw was people going, hey, you got this wrong, everybody go watch the Missing Enigmas videos. So I went and I watched the Missing Enigmas videos, went, oh, I got this wrong, and then I DM'd Nick and was like, hey, do you want to come on and talk about Missing 411 with me? And now we have a great working relationship. I feel that the quality of my work has improved as a result of people telling me I was wrong and need to do better research. That's all I'm doing here, is the exact same thing as those commenters. So I apologize if that came across as rude or smug. It was not intended that way. I didn't write this down. It's kind of off the cuff. All that is to say that when I'm criticizing somebody's work, that's all I'm doing. I'm not trying to ride their coattails, I'm not clout chasing. I do all of my own original research for these videos, and I consult sources that disagree with me or sources that are popular as well, just because I want to see, all right, how'd they do? Did they catch something I didn't? Is there a reason to worry about the popular narrative? It's not an attack on these people as individuals. All of that said, this book has credibility issues. While Unsolved Disappearances does have a bibliography, it does not contain endnotes, footnotes, or even inline citations. And on top of that, reading the bibliography itself, Baldwin doesn't cite specific issues of archival documents, but rather the entire archive that she's using. As I said in the Ramsey video, this makes it functionally impossible to verify anything that she's written, especially since one citation in the bibliography literally reads, numerous internet websites. That chapter on Abe Ramsey, which refers to the missing child as Abraham Carroll Ramsey, when all contemporary reports name him as Abraham Lincoln Ramsey, also gets the story wrong in basically every single way. To quickly recap, Baldwin claimed that the family dog Motley ran into the woods after hearing other dogs barking, and that several hours later, 3-year-old Abe went off into the woods to look for the dog. In reality, there was no dog named Motley, and Abe went missing after he tried to follow his siblings to a store. She also claimed that this fictional dog was found injured under the porch, which again, entirely fabricated. Following this, Baldwin says that around 4 p.m., the rest of the Ramsey children arrived home from school and were immediately sent out to look for Abe, but they too failed to locate the child. Quick reminder, they weren't at school, they were at the store. Baldwin continues the story by saying that when Abe's moonshining father, John Ramsey, who also pretended to run a mill as a day job, returned home that afternoon, he too searched for his son miles into the forest, but it was to no avail. She also claims that decades later, another moonshiner, or perhaps John Ramsey himself, confessed on his deathbed to having shot Abraham Lincoln Ramsey and then burying him inside of one of the mash barrels underground. Allegedly, this occurred because the moonshiners were up at the still, heard something trudging through the forest, called out asking for the password, and then, hearing nothing, shot randomly into the woods. I did go into some more detail about this in the Abe Ramsey video itself, but I just want to give you a summary version to move on quickly. I bring this up because, as you might be anticipating, there is absolutely no evidence that John Ramsey was involved in the moonshine industry, and there is also no evidence, no documentation, of this alleged shooting and the alleged confession of a man who mistook a 3-year-old boy for a federal liquor agent. If you're wondering why I'm so frustrated about this specific case, it's because the real story was not particularly difficult to find. It was published in multiple newspapers on March 27th, 28th, and 31st of 1919, and the first of which, published in the Tennessean, bears the headline, "Mystery Solved as Body of Lost Child is Found." According to the author of that article, the body of Abraham Lincoln Ramsey was found in a hollow log in a dense forest about 3 miles from his home. It was thought the boy had crawled into the log to seek shelter and then had died there either of exposure or hunger. In my opinion, something like a spider bite would also be possible because it would be difficult to find after 2 weeks of decomposition. The Abe Ramsey section isn't the only one in Juanita Baldwin's book that has what appeared to be fabrications in it, as Unsolved Disappearances also covers the disappearances of Trenny Gibson and Dennis Martin. I didn't want to make this video entirely about dunking on another researcher's work, but I felt it was my responsibility to put this out there given how ubiquitous the Baldwin version of this story is. Now that said, it is still weird as all hell. Looking over the evidence, there's really only a few possibilities here. She may have been a victim of foul play, and there are 2 possible ways that could have happened. One of them is that she could have been kidnapped upon reaching the parking lot. That, of course, begs the question of why. Nobody ever received a ransom letter, and in the trafficking industry, 58-year-old women are not exactly a common target. Another possibility could be that someone who was local to the area, perhaps involved in the drug trade or just a petty criminal, saw her hiking, saw that she had on a diamond watch band and several diamond rings, and thought, hey, I will rob this person. If this is what happened, it is unlikely yet possible that she could have died as a result of this encounter and that whoever was the perpetrator, carried her off somewhere. In that circumstance, I think what was brought up about the bear actually is a little bit more relevant because Polly was not a small woman. She was, again, 5'10", 5'11", and 170 to 180 pounds. Even just carrying that along a simple level trail is gonna be difficult. Carrying that much weight across this landscape, damn near impossible for your average person. In an isolated incident, I could see why somebody might go to the conclusion of a certain, big-footed type of creature, but there's no evidence of that kind of thing in this area. We've looked at a lot of these cases so far, and not once has Bigfoot been a reasonable conclusion. And I'm not even saying that from the position of saying Bigfoot doesn't exist. I'm just saying if Bigfoot exists, he's not here. Now, the tree people, that's another question, another thing for another time. You know what? No, the tree people is a thing for right now. Back when we were down in Tennessee a couple of years ago, riding around with Wendigoon in this specific park, he was telling us about some of the folklore of the area, some stories that his grandfather had told him. One of them was about the tree men or the tree knockers, who were people or people-like creatures that lived out in the woods of the Smoky Mountains, long ago. This is not in the last 20 years. We're talking about the early 1900s. Now, these tree men obviously lived out in the woods, but the reason they were called tree knockers was because in the presence of humans like us, they would communicate by knocking on trees. We were told that these tree knockers are neither evil nor good. They just kind of live out in the woods, and depending on the story you're looking at, some people never see them, some people do encounter them, some people are attacked, some people are helped. It's not dissimilar from the stories you hear about certain kinds of fae over in Europe, specifically the British Isles, which makes sense because the Appalachian region was settled primarily by Celtic folks. And of course, if we are to play the little game of, could this be real? Well, the Appalachians were once part of the same mountain range as those in the Highlands of Scotland. So if these fae folk really do live underground and travel through the other world, well, would make sense that there's an other world in the Appalachians too. If I can remember which video it was, and I can remember to actually do this, then I will put a link in the description to a video where we talked about the history of this region, the Cherokee, the Celtic influence, all of that, because personally I think it's interesting. Suffice to say, my point here is that if there's a paranormal explanation, I would lean towards the tree knockers. We also just recently went on a trip to Alaska, and one of the girls who came along was from the Smoky Mountains, specifically Great Smoky Mountains National Park, lives basically in the park. And when we brought this up kind of, half jokingly, she was like, oh no, that's a thing. There are forest people. There are people that just live in the woods. We're going to try and talk about that more extensively with her when we actually go down to the park in a couple of months to do the meta-analysis video on site. So I will bring you more information on that then. If you are watching this video sometime after November of 2024, it's up. Anyway, those are the options for if something else caused her to disappear. Another possibility would be that it was a wild animal that ran her off trail, but like we said, she was pretty unhealthy. She was a smoker, probably wasn't going to run all that far, especially in this kind of terrain. So it seems more likely than not that the dogs would have scented her body. Also, people running in terror from a bear typically aren't, watching their steps, so there probably would have been tracks. Looking at the other main possibility, which was that she intended to disappear, that's certainly a more believable one. You don't need the stuff that was in Juanita Baldwin's book to be accurate in order for that to be true. The stuff she wrote about definitely builds a stronger case if we trust that she's not making it up, but we can't trust that. The question I would have in that circumstance is simply, why? What's the point? Why disappear? If she was tired of her life, tired of having a husband who was 20 years older than her and going and spending all of her summers at a campground she loved with her closest friends, and she wanted to escape, well, if it was all about the husband aspect of it and not wanting to go through with the whole divorce process, he was suffering from a heart condition. He was 78 years old. It's morbid to say it, but she could have waited him out. In addition to that, not only was her husband a part owner of this campground, but also her father was a part owner of this campground, her 89-year-old father. If both of those men passed away, she stood to inherit a good amount of estate, if not money. So if the issue here was that she didn't like her life as it was, she could have waited a few more years and would have been in a much better position than somebody who disappears at the age of 58 and just starts over completely. It would also mean that she never again contacted a single family member, that she just into thin air, gone, without a single care about these people who, so far as I can tell from the reports, she did love. It's not like she was estranged from her family. And you would think that somebody wouldn't, just vanish completely without telling their ailing father that they're disappearing, without saying goodbye to the man. Of course, all of these are assumptions, but in this case, all we have to work on is assumptions. And I will preface this part by saying there is absolutely zero evidence of this. But one other possibility I could see is that her sister had something to do with it because she wanted to be the sole inheritor. But like I said, there's really nothing to support that. It's just something that, pops into my head as a possible intrigue. Last possible thing I can think of is witness protection, but why? Just why? There's just no reason, nothing suggesting she would have gone into witness protection. It's just not there. So looking through everything, what's strange about this case isn't necessarily that there's a whole bunch of really weird things that happened. It's that nothing weird happened. That the only weird thing that happened here is she disappeared. Everything else about this entire situation is as normal as it gets. And in a way, everything being so normal is what makes this so strange, because it's not often that we get through the research process on one of these cases and I'm like, yeah, I have absolutely no idea what could have happened here. And in this case, I have absolutely no idea what happened here. There's not a single likely explanation. There's just a series of unlikely explanations that are slightly more likely than each other. All I can think is that maybe this will be elucidated a little bit more when we actually get down there to Deep Creek, when we look around ourselves. I'll try and interview some people, some rangers, see if I can corroborate anything Juanita Baldwin said, see if I can officially debunk anything she said. And, maybe as we're walking along that trail, we'll be like, oh, well, that's a weird little spot. Maybe she's in there, and who knows. But at the moment, I'm at a loss. I don't know. Aiden, what do you think?
I'm captivated by your use of the word, I think it was elucidated?
That's what you took away from this?
You really just slipped that in there thinking nobody was going to notice, but I am impressed.
Yeah,
I'm thoroughly impressed.
For somebody who never took the SAT, I did remember a lot of the SAT words. What I was asking you was, what do you think, having heard this? Anyway, Aiden said he thinks that my conclusion seems most likely, which makes me question if he was watching because I didn't have one.
Your conclusion being the lack of clear conclusions.
Oh, okay, there we go.
Yeah.
All right, so we're on the same page.
Yeah, 100%. No, there are so many different options that it could have been without any even remotely concrete evidence to one being the more likely option.
Yeah,
So it's up in the air.
Why did all the cars decide to start going right now?
They really didn't want me to talk today.
I guess so. They were like, no, your place is behind the camera.
I was on the last episode too much.
Far too much. We had that little, had the little booty wiggle, and I think the internet just decided no more.
Yeah.
That was my fault. I filmed that. Yeah. Not intentionally. It just kind of happened. If you want to support what we're doing here at the Lore Lodge, you can subscribe to us here on YouTube or on Patreon for just $1 a month. That helps us fund the channel, helps us grow, helps us improve things. You also get access to a very fun little Liquored Lore episode every month. That's where Aiden and I get a little silly and talk about something that happened. If you would like to support us in a more material way, I should say if you don't want to support us, that's perfectly fine too. I mean, you do you. If you do want to, however, a more material way you can do that is by buying this shirt or one of the other one of the other 3 shirts we have available at bunkerbranding.com. They are all very comfy. They are made right here in the United States of America, and they were designed by Americans. So it is a brand you can really feel good about supporting. If you would prefer to, drink the Lodge rather than wear it, you can do so by going to tableauroastingco.com, clicking on the collaborations tab, and buying our coffee, Mount Pocono Perk. I designed it myself. I was a barista at an artisan roastery. I actually did choose the specific coffees and the specific roast temperatures. This was not me grabbing a random coffee off of a digital shelf and slapping our branding on it. One of the best ways to keep updated on everything that's going on here, be aware of, things like our Trova Trip adventure that we went on recently, new releases in the Bunker Branding store, and other just general new stuff about this channel. The best way to do that is by joining our Discord at bit.ly/jointhelodge. That is one of the better ways to get more Lodge, but other ways to get more Lodge would be to watch our podcast. It is live at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday nights. That is the new time slot, Monday nights. Every single week, unless there's a reason it's not, but we are pretty good about letting you know when that's going to happen. If you can't catch it live, then of course it's right here on YouTube as a video on demand, and we also pop these up on every single podcast platform we can find. Just head over to there, look up the Lore Lodge, and you will find it. We also have more channels. We have the Weird Bible, where we sit down with Wendigoon approximately once a month if we're lucky, and we talk about just supernatural aspects of the Bible, crazy stories, just fun stuff about religion. It is a Bible show for people who are interested in learning about the Bible. It's not a Bible show for Christians. It's not a Bible show for atheists. It's a Bible show for people who are interested in the Bible. We also have the History Hut. We have had that channel for a little while. It has a few videos on it. We're working on bringing a hardcore sit-down recorded podcast over there. That is in the works and hopefully is coming in the new year. And finally, the last of the channels we have that has content consistently going up on it is my personal channel, Aiden Mattis, at the Aiden Mattis here on YouTube. That's mostly gaming streams at the moment. Sometimes we do music, sometimes we do commentary and reaction. It typically is a Tuesday, Thursday, Friday schedule, 6 p.m. to 9 p.m., but that's not quite as concrete. But Friday is almost always a go. In addition to those channels that are hosted by us particularly, we have 2 other ones, Off the Record and Boozy Mixologist. As you might expect, those are a music channel and a music commentary channel, I should say, and then also a mixology channel, bartending. Luke Eccles, the Off the Record guy, he's going to talk to you about the stories of bands, music news, things like that. Whereas Celso, our guy over at Boozy Mixologist, he sits down and he teaches you how to make drinks, tells you the story of how something came to be, why a cocktail is popular, and general stuff like that. I think that just about wraps everything up. I want to thank Rocket Money again for sponsoring this video, and I will see all of you guys on the next one. I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.